My grandparents on my mother's side live in Arbage. We rarely went there because there was no car, and it was long and inconvenient to get by bus. This time we went in Dad's work car. Since my dad and grandfather are avid fishermen, they did not have time to drink tea before they packed fishing rods, a tent, a boat, and we went to the lake near the village. We drove for about 2 hours. The road is terrible with potholes. We were at the place in the evening. Dad immediately pumped up the boat and sailed away to fish, and Grandpa and I set up a tent and lit a fire. Everything was ready. We fished a little from the shore. We caught some change and started cooking dinner. My grandfather was not a timid man, but he believed in omens, and then he somehow tensed up, became silent and tense in some way. I asked him, "What's the matter? It's very quiet here. Even the birds don't sing and there's no wind. A lull is not good." And somehow strangely he looked at me angrily. I froze in place. Until Dad arrived, my grandfather was almost silent. I was very surprised, because my grandfather loved me very much and played with me or joked all the time. And then he became so sad, taciturn. Anyway, Dad arrived when it got dark. The sun had already completely set. We were sitting around the campfire having dinner, talking about something, and then Grandpa jumped up on the spot. There was wild horror in his eyes, and he looked towards the lake. When I looked there, I was speechless, almost dying of fear. Something was moving towards us from the lake. It was white and transparent, like a huge old man with a beard, 5 meters high. He swam to about the middle of the lake, but there were no ripples or circles in the water. I'm paralyzed. I can't move or scream. He stopped and looked at his grandfather, then pointed at him with his finger, and without turning around, swam back. Then he went under the water, and there were no more circles on the water. I started having a wild tantrum. Without collecting anything, we jumped into the car and drove home. Grandma gave me tea and put me to bed, but I couldn't sleep and heard the whole conversation, which I still remember. My grandfather and Dad were drinking vodka in the kitchen because of the stress they were going through, and there was a thin partition. My grandfather drank, put down the glass, and said he was going to die soon. My father and grandmother started scolding him for saying that, and my grandfather told my father, "You heard what he said." My father tells him that he didn't say anything. And my grandfather told him the following. He points his finger at me and says that you have 3 days left to live. Ask everyone for forgiveness and finish what you didn't do. I'll come for you in 3 days. The next morning we went home. It's my mom's birthday on the 16th, so I remember the date when it happened. We bought a gift, told everyone everything, and Mom started crying. We couldn't calm her down for a long time. She told us the following. My mother, as soon as she gave birth to me, died on the same day. My grandfather left my mother and married my late grandmother's sister, and it turned out that, according to my grandfather, he would die on my mother's birthday. That's what happened. My grandfather died on the evening of the 16th. In the morning, Mom was not in the mood and did not want to celebrate her birthday. We didn't have a phone, just like my grandmother. We didn't have the opportunity to call and find out about my grandfather's well-being. Everyone was tense to the limit. Her friends came to my mom. They were sitting, drinking, and then the doorbell rang. A neighbor came and called my mom. I thought I had come to congratulate her, but no, my grandmother called from the village, from the school where she once worked as a teacher. My mother came in tears and told me that my grandfather had died. The next morning we arrived in the village, dressed grandfather ourselves, and at night he was already in the house. The first night went fine, but we barely survived the second night. From the room where grandfather was lying in a coffin, we heard his voice. He was talking to someone, and this someone answered him. They were fighting. Grandpa was screaming. No one dared to enter there, not even the men who were with us in the kitchen. They were all wildly scared. After 5 minutes, everyone came out of their stupor and ran out of the house. At the same time, everyone spent the night with the neighbors. The next morning they went to get the coffin, and the men came out with horror in their eyes. The coffin was overturned, and my grandfather had bruises on his face and neck. Nothing like this has happened since the funeral, or in my life either. I still can't figure out what it was. The young man tears his hair in despair. Burning tears are streaming down his face. Madness is frozen in his eyes. Look, why do I need all this? Why take away everyone I care about? What is it worth living for now? I have nothing left. My family, my parents, my sister, they died, and I was left all alone in this world. I hate him. These thoughts were spinning in the guy's head, and in his madness he screamed, "I hate you, Creator. I'll decide for myself when I die." And the icon flew into the wall, the fragments scattered around the room. The young man did not pick them up and left without noticing how bloody tears flowed from the eyes of the Virgin Mary. Robert was only 21 years old. His whole life was ahead of him, but he had already become disillusioned with everything. Just a month ago, his family died in a car accident, on the day when this terrible accident occurred, which claimed the lives of the closest people. Robert quarreled with his father and did not go on vacation with his family, which saved his life. But still, the guy could not survive the loss, and it seemed that he died with his family, not physically, but mentally. He dropped out of university and tried to drown out his grief with alcohol, and his common sense increasingly gave way to an all-consuming mental madness. The first time he tried to commit suicide was when he returned to an empty house after a long funeral. After drinking for courage, Robert decided to swallow the pills, because it's easier than hanging himself or cutting his wrists. After gutting the packages of various medicines, he swallowed several dozen colorful roundels, and after a few minutes, his consciousness shut down. Robert woke up the next day and felt good. Without understanding anything, he thought that he had dreamt of everything yesterday and the ill-fated pills, but the scattered empty packages said otherwise. The guy understood that his turn had not yet come, but he did not want to accept his fate, and every time the pain inside became unbearable, he tried to take his own life. Recently, he cut his wrists with a sharp blade, but he was saved in time. They just said that the ambulance received an anonymous call. Who was it? The bleeding young man was taken to the hospital. He spent 2 weeks there and was registered with a psychiatrist. Robert was sitting at the table. He had just returned from the hospital yesterday, and the deep cuts on his wrists were hidden by thick bandages. There was a glass of vodka on the table, and Robert stared at its surface with empty eyes. He definitely decided that he no longer wants to live in this world where there is no justice, and at any moment you can lose everything at once. After drinking vodka in one gulp, he coughed and, jumping up, ran out into the entrance. Jumping over the steps, he went up to the 9th floor and opened the window in the entrance, took a last breath and rushed down. A few seconds of falling, from which the ears are completely blocked, and a thud, like from hitting a rag body on the ground. Well, this is the end, Robert manages to think, and a wave of pain sweeps away his consciousness. The rays of the sun hit right in his eyes, and the guy wakes up, wincing. He is lying on a hospital bed, transparent tubes with liquid stretched out to his hands. 2 legs are raised and fixed. They are broken and sealed with plaster. His stomach and arms are also bandaged. His whole body is covered in bruises and scratches. His face hurts and is clearly very swollen. One eye is swollen and opens with great difficulty. Damn it. Did I really survive? How is this even possible? I should have been flattened into a pancake. I don't understand anything, the guy thought absently. Suddenly, a nurse in a white long robe and a cap entered the room, which looked rather ridiculous on her. The girl came close to Robert's bed, and he was able to examine her face in detail. Blue, naively wide eyes framed by thick black eyelashes, plump pink lips, upturned nose, and rosy cheeks. All this splendor was framed by golden waves of hair. One curly curl playfully peeking out from under the cap. Little angel, thought Robert, and something pricked his heart. The girl asked the guy for a long time about his physical condition, and also smiled and joked with him. It turned out that her name was Helen, and she had just graduated from medical college and was interning at this hospital. Robert looked at the girl, and the grief in his soul became quieter. Love took over his heart, and the guy suddenly wanted to live in his thoughts. He already imagined their common future, 2 beautiful children, a strong, happy family. A few weeks passed, and Robert was on the mend. Mentally, he had already decided to ask Helen out on a date. He saw that the girl also had feelings for him. I love her. She gave me hope and a desire to live. I want to be with her always, to protect her, to give her love, to watch her smile, and these wonderful dimples appear on her cheeks, the guy thought, and fell asleep with a happy smile on his face. In the morning, Helen rushes to Robert's room. Her soul is restless, and she wants to make sure that everything is all right with the young man. She went over to his bunk and smiled. The guy was fast asleep. The girl gently ran her palm over his cheek, and a shiver ran through her body. Robert was like ice. Helen grabbed his wrist. There was no pulse. The girl, sobbing, ran for the doctors. The diagnosis was simple, a heart attack. But strangely enough, the guy's heart was fine before. Helen grieved for several days in a row, and on the 40th day after Robert's death, she had a dream. Robert stood as if alive and smiled. There was no pain in his eyes anymore, only a serene calmness. He took Helen's hand and said, "Honey, stop grieving. I'm always with you, hugging you by the shoulders and protecting you. I am to blame for what happened. I angered God by not valuing my life, and when I finally realized how much I wanted to live for you, he took it away from me. But I'm always there for you, remember that." Clutching the girl's hand tightly, Robert disappeared, and Helen woke up. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and the feeling that Robert was there, still holding her hand tightly, did not disappear. Several years passed, but Helen was never able to get married. As soon as she met a man she liked, and they began an affair, the guy disappeared without a trace. She often saw Robert at night, and he as then held her hand tightly. He just looked at her and didn't say anything. Helen recently met Dan and realized that she was madly in love. They quickly began a relationship, and the girl moved to live in his apartment. The oddities began immediately. Things moved by themselves. Dishes broke. Various minor troubles happened. The girl began to suffer from terrible dreams involving Robert. In a dream, he uttered only one phrase: "You're only mine. I will never give you to another." Helen was terribly scared and ran to the local grandmother healer. When she told the woman her story, she advised her, "Go to his grave and leave this stone here." The woman handed her a wrinkled black stone. "And then leave, but don't you dare turn around. If you turn around, there will be trouble." Helen immediately went to the cemetery, and after doing everything as the healer advised, the girl turned her back to the grave and walked away. But then she felt as if an invisible force was pulling her hand out hard. Startled, Helen turned around and seemed to see Robert in front of her with her own eyes. In the morning, an elderly watchman found a dead girl lying next to Robert's grave. Her hair was white as snow, as if she had seen death itself. This story happened to me recently, just the other day. There won't be a word about poltergeists, brownies, and ghosts here, but the incident itself seemed strange to me. That evening, I was waiting for the train on the platform of the metro station. When the train arrived, I immediately jumped in and plopped down on the first seat I saw. I had to drive home from work for almost an hour, and I was going to take a nap. I usually fall asleep almost immediately, only occasionally opening my eyes so as not to oversleep my stop. And then, after driving a couple of stops, I woke up with a strong chill. I felt so cold, as if I was driving in an open-top car in winter. I opened my eyes and looked at the already full carriage. Suddenly, my gaze abruptly stopped on an elderly lady. Of course, there are always a lot of them in the evenings, but this lady really caught my attention. She was sitting across from me, twirling small, even pieces of paper in her hands. Well, you know, stationery stores have something like tear-off sheets. She was sorting through the name cards like a librarian. She takes out the second one and also looks at people. I, in turn, couldn't take my eyes off her while I was looking at her. And it's so cold, it's terribly simple. Grandma had a stern look and a serious face, like a postal employee. What also got me hooked was that she was all in black. Absolutely everything, right down to the gloves and a small handbag with a hat. A girl and her friend were sitting next to me, and they were chatting loudly and very cheerfully about something. Grandma took another small piece of paper, looked at it, and looked at the laughing girl. She stared at her for a long time without changing her expression at all. I immediately understood everything and reached for the phone. I opened it. I sit and pretend that I'm watching something interesting there, and I set up the camera faster for Grandma. My camera was stuck. I couldn't turn it off, close it, or turn it on again. I click on the phone. It does not turn off. The reboot is not performed. Then the phone sadly beeped about a 3% charge and turned itself off. I sat and thought about how it could be, because I carefully charged it before leaving, and it was new. And so, while I was running my fingers back and forth, I felt goosebumps running along my skin in different directions, too. I got goosebumps again. I looked up and realized that this grandmother was staring at me intently. I was so stunned. I was so scared. She has one. A determined look. I quickly put the phone in my pocket. Goosebumps ran through my body, but she continued to stare and stare. She looks at me, then returns to her list. I've probably had too much. My jaw is already cramping. I'm almost clenching my teeth. I'm shaking like a rabbit. It's cold here, like at the North Pole. There are people everywhere, but Grandma and I are like in the Matrix. You can't hear anything around, like in slow motion. In short, me, Grandma, and the file cabinet, which I'm not in. The papers in Grandma's fingers rustled for the 5th time. I was praying when my stop came. Suddenly, the girl next to me started laughing. and I moved away from hypnosis. I turn my head and look. Grandma has already turned her attention to my loud-voiced neighbor. I look at her hands, at the fact that she pulled out one piece of paper from her stack and pinched it with her finger. She looks at the girl herself, but she doesn't seem to notice her at all. At the next stop, the girl kissed her friend, waved her hand, and went to the exit. Grandma follows her. She stands aside and does not take her eyes off her, but she does not look at me anymore. The train stopped, and the girl and her grandmother disappeared into the crowd. Like an owl with 5-cent eyes, I turned my head to the window and saw that this girl and Grandma were walking hand in hand. The grandmother walks in front, and the girl trudges a little behind. I watched them go until the train pulled away, hiding the couple from sight. I sat down in my seat and drove home without goosebumps on my skin. There was no cold. I came home, turned on my phone, plugged it into the charger, and it happily beeps to me that it is fully charged. So how do you understand this? Now I wonder what kind of grandmother she was. There are many assumptions, including the fact that she's just not herself. It's spring now and aggravation, but this nonsense with the phone and the fact that she took a strange girl with her worries me.